Beneath the crowns, behind the portraits, hidden in the margins of royal history, are the children they never wanted you to see. Disabled, ill, fragile, or simply inconvenient, these heirs and spares were edited out of the royal narrative, buried under silence, or institutionalized behind locked doors. This isn't about scandal. It's about the cost of appearing perfect. 30 royals, 30 secrets, one long tradition of pretending nothing was ever wrong. Welcome to 30 British royals who had disabled children they tried to hide. You won't find these stories in the official family tree, but they're part of the bloodline. Before we begin peeling back the royal wallpaper, take a second to subscribe if you love long-form mysteries that history tried to bury. Let us know in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it right now? Midnight? 3 a.m.? Are you supposed to be sleeping or working? Either way, you're in the right place. 1. King George V. King George V ruled over an empire that never slept, never faltered, never bled in public. And he expected the same of his children. That was a problem, because one of them couldn't keep up. Prince John was the youngest, the sixth child, and the one who didn't quite fit. From early on, there were signs: epileptic seizures, difficulty with speech, unpredictable behaviors. Today, some believe he may have been autistic, but in Edwardian England, difficult was diagnosis enough. And in a royal family obsessed with control, deviation had no place at the dinner table or in public. By age 4, Prince John was largely absent from public engagements. By age 11, he was relocated, exiled, to a small farmhouse on the Sandringham estate, known as Wood Farm. There, he lived under the care of a nanny, out of sight and increasingly out of mind. When he died of a seizure at age 13, the court issued a statement that was brief, cold, and efficient. His existence had been quietly erased before it was officially ended. The royal family called it an act of mercy, but mercy rarely comes with locked doors. What makes this more unsettling is what came next, because hiding Prince John wasn't just a one-time act. It was a training exercise, and the woman who learned that lesson best was his mother. 2. Queen Mary, Mary of Teck. Queen Mary was the image of imperial motherhood, stoic, dignified, emotionally unavailable. She believed in form over feeling, etiquette over empathy, and above all, discretion. It's said she rarely visited her youngest son, John, once he was sent away to Wood Farm. The official story was that she found it too painful to see him suffer. The unofficial version is far colder. She didn't want the royal image tainted by what couldn't be controlled. Behind palace walls, Mary was both a mother and an enforcer. Her devotion was conditional, her affection earned, and her children, especially her daughters, grew up under the weight of performance. John's condition, both physical and developmental, didn't just disturb the carefully rehearsed choreography of royal life. It broke it. So instead of adapting, the family decided to edit him out of the scene entirely. When John died, Mary's diary entry was brief. Dear little Johnny died at 5:30 suddenly. No flourish, no grief. Just a line item in the logbook of monarchy. And then silence. The photograph albums moved on. The portraits never included him. The line of succession marched forward, untroubled. But the strategy of concealment didn't die with John. It simply evolved. And the next royal in line would learn to play both roles, the visible heir and the hidden patient. Strange, isn't it? How silence can echo louder than a royal decree? If you're still with us, hit that subscribe button for more stories history politely avoids. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is glowing on your screen right now? Midnight? Dawn? The middle of a sleepless afternoon? We're building a global circle of night owls and curious minds. 3. King George VI. Before he was king, he was Albert. And before he was Albert, he was the second son, overshadowed, overlooked, and often overwhelmed. George VI grew up with a stammer that derailed public speeches and haunted private conversations. But what few outside the palace knew was that he also had two daughters, and one of them didn't develop quite as expected. Princess Margaret, the younger sister, was a royal firecracker, charming, theatrical, and emotionally volatile. From early childhood, it was clear she struggled in ways her sister Elizabeth didn't. She was late to walk, late to talk, and prone to tantrums that didn't quite align with the ideal of royal childhood. Some historians have hinted at mild developmental delays in her early years, something the royal household denied, ignored, and suppressed in the press. When she grew older, those early signs didn't fade, they just changed costumes. Margaret's adult life was punctuated by depression, substance use, and increasingly erratic behavior. But the monarchy wrapped her struggles in tulle and tiaras, framing her as the rebellious sister, the misunderstood royal, the party girl. It made for better headlines than the truth, that behind the glamour was a woman unraveling under the weight of a role she never chose. Her father saw it coming. He had lived it. But what he didn't see, what no one could predict, was that even his more perfect daughter wasn't as untouched as she seemed. 4. King George VI, Princess Elizabeth. Before she became the icon in pearls, before the stoic wave, the eternal handbag, the coated brooches, Elizabeth was a nervous child with a peculiar relationship to her own body. Her father, George VI, understood fragility well. He passed it on, not through weakness, but through the sheer force of expectation. Elizabeth was never officially sick. That would be undignified. But palace insiders whispered about early coordination problems, learning delays, and trouble adapting to royal instruction. It wasn't dramatic, just slow. She was quiet, observant, hesitant. Tutors noted her need for repetition. Her governesses tailored lessons around what they delicately described as processing lags. Nothing scandalous, but enough to worry the institution obsessed with readiness. It was brushed off, of course. She's just shy, they said, reserved. And so, with time, the problems blurred into the narrative of a thoughtful heir, a slow-to-speak but wise child, a queen in the making, and in many ways, that was true. Elizabeth worked harder than anyone. She mastered the performative choreography of monarchy with surgical precision. She became a national symbol, not because she was naturally suited to it, but because she had been rigorously trained to look like she was. But the cost of looking composed is rarely calculated in public, because while Elizabeth managed to adapt, others were discarded entirely, hidden behind walls, erased from family trees, declared dead while still breathing. Their names were only rediscovered by accident, like the next two women who belonged to the Queen's own bloodline and were locked away for life. 5. Queen Elizabeth II, Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon. They were her first cousins. Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, born into privilege, christened with titles, smiled at by nurses who already understood their fates better than they did. From childhood, it was clear they were different. They had profound learning disabilities, severe enough that they never functioned independently. But instead of supporting them publicly, the royal family chose silence. In 1941, when Nerissa was 22 and Catherine 15, both were placed in the Royal Earlswood Hospital for mentally disabled patients in Red Hill, Surrey. Not a private clinic, not a palace annex, a Victorian institution with iron gates and regimented routines. There they remained, out of sight, out of conversation, and eventually out of recorded existence. Because when Burke's Peerage was published in the 1960s, the official record listed them both as dead. Died young, it said. Forgotten footnotes. Even as they lived on, quietly, for decades. Nerissa died in 1986, aged 66. Catherine in 2014. When the story finally broke, the palace called it an administrative error. But no one was fooled. The family had known. The Queen Mother, Queen Elizabeth II, the entire inner circle. And yet none visited, none acknowledged, none spoke. What kind of legacy is that? It wasn't just about hiding disabilities. It was about sanitizing a bloodline, keeping the narrative of perfection intact, whatever the cost. But the thing about institutional secrets is that once you normalize one, you start making a habit of them. And one royal had already learned that trick, with her own children. 6. The Queen Mother. Long before she was a sweet old woman waving from balconies and hiding gin in her handbag, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was a strategist. And like all good strategists, she understood one simple rule. The crown must appear flawless, even if the family behind it isn't. Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon were her nieces, her brother's daughters. She knew them well. She watched them struggle from infancy, and she signed off, quietly, when they were sent away. The official story was that it was for their own good, that a royal upbringing would be too overwhelming. But this was 1941. The nation was at war. Royal imagery was being weaponized as morale. There wasn't room for what couldn't be turned into a photograph. So she distanced herself. Not cruelly, just efficiently. She offered funding, oversight, a respectable veil of silence. The girls' existence became a family footnote. Their birthdays weren't celebrated. Their milestones weren't marked. Even their deaths, one in 1986, one in 2014, passed without public statement. It's a strange kind of grief, to mourn someone you pretended was already gone. The Queen Mother maintained her saintly image, the grandmother of the nation. But behind the pearls and pastel coats was a woman who had made hard choices, ones that wouldn't be the last, because the pattern didn't stop there. In fact, the next royal on this list had 2 children, and both of them faced conditions that needed managing, not medically, politically. 7. Princess Marina, Duchess of Kent. Princess Marina had the rare distinction of being both a Greek princess and a British duchess, married to Prince George, the dashing youngest son of King George V. She played the royal game well, stoic, stylish, and strategically silent. But behind the scenes, her family life did not follow the script. Her son, Prince Edward, the current Duke of Kent, suffered from epilepsy in childhood. In a family where weakness was hidden and health was political, this was not a footnote. It was a problem. Epilepsy, particularly in the mid-20th century, was a condition steeped in stigma. It was misunderstood, feared, and often confused with mental instability. And so, just as had been done with Prince John a generation before, the family closed ranks. Edward's seizures were treated quietly, discreetly, without public mention. Doctors were summoned privately. Household staff were given instructions. Marina managed it all with icy efficiency. And when Edward grew older and the seizures reportedly lessened, the palace simply allowed the condition to vanish from the public record, as if it had never existed. The story became, he had been healthy all along, but this wasn't an isolated case. In fact, Marina's other child, the elegant Princess Alexandra, also battled with an invisible condition that was carefully tucked beneath tiaras and ceremony. Because in the royal world, even hearing loss could be considered an imperfection. And that brings us to the second secret hidden behind Marina's famously sculpted cheekbones. 8. Princess Marina, Princess Alexandra. Princess Alexandra, born in 1936, was known for her poise, her grace, and her unwavering public image. She was the royal who never caused scandal, never drifted from the script, and never showed anything resembling imperfection. Which is why few ever knew that she struggled with serious hearing problems from a young age. The condition wasn't widely disclosed, of course. In official biographies and public appearances, there was no mention of her hearing loss. It would have been considered too delicate, too suggestive of fragility. And so, like many royals before her, Alexandra learned to compensate. Lip reading, strategic seating at events, carefully controlled interviews. Aides were trained to cue her subtly, and everything, from lighting to acoustics, was adjusted to preserve the illusion of ease. Her hearing impairment wasn't a tragedy, it wasn't debilitating, but it was inconvenient, especially to an institution that demands perfection in every photograph, every speech, every smile. And so the issue became another royal whisper. Something acknowledged only in the margins. She continued with her duties admirably, but those who worked closely with her knew the extra layer of complexity involved. It was just never discussed publicly, not until decades later, when the world had shifted and disabilities were no longer treated as secrets. But in her youth, it stayed under wraps. Still, even hearing loss couldn't compare to what the next royal may have faced. A prince whose name has all but disappeared from history, and whose rumored condition challenges the very foundations of royal masculinity. A prince who may never have fit the mold at all. 9. King Edward VII. His reign was short, his waistline was not. Edward VII, son of Queen Victoria, was the playboy monarch who waited a lifetime to inherit the crown. But long before he ascended the throne, he had a son who troubled the royal narrative more than anyone expected. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence. Albert Victor was charming, handsome, in the classical way, and deeply confusing to those around him. Reports from tutors, military instructors, and foreign diplomats paint a picture of a young man who struggled, socially, intellectually, perhaps developmentally. He had trouble following instructions. He drifted during conversations. He underperformed at university, barely scraping through. Some historians have speculated about a learning disability. Others have gone further, suggesting he may have been developmentally delayed or neurologically atypical. But none of it ever made the papers. Why? Because Edward VII and the entire royal machine worked overtime to protect the narrative that Albert Victor was a future king in waiting, perfectly suitable, perfectly normal. They even betrothed him to Mary of Teck, the same Mary who would later marry his brother George V after Albert Victor's sudden death at age 28. His cause of death? Pneumonia, officially. But the truth, as always, was far murkier. The silence surrounding his decline was almost rehearsed. He was buried with honors. But the air around him had always been filled with doubt, the kind you couldn't quite put into words. And speaking of heirs with broken bloodlines, no one symbolized that contradiction quite like his grandmother, the woman who passed on more than just a crown. 10. Queen Victoria, Prince Leopold. Queen Victoria had 9 children, but only one of them became a cautionary tale for future royal marriages. Prince Leopold, her youngest son, was born with 2 invisible inheritances, a love of the arts and a blood disorder that would haunt the royal bloodline for generations. Hemophilia, the so-called royal disease, and along with it, epilepsy, a double diagnosis that the palace rarely discussed in daylight. Leopold was intelligent, sensitive, and frail. He limped through childhood, not just physically but politically. His mother adored him, but saw him as unfit for military service or heavy public duties. He bled easily. He bruised mysteriously. The smallest fall could be fatal. But in official portraits, he was shown upright, noble, unbroken. The court adjusted. They disguised his ailments as quirks. Public appearances were carefully stage-managed. Medical details were reduced to vague euphemisms. Not well suited for exertion. Delicate health. Susceptible to fatigue. He died at age 30, after a minor fall led to a fatal brain hemorrhage. It was the kind of ending that might have triggered panic in any other family, but in this one, it sparked silence. Victoria mourned, but also managed. She refocused the public gaze on more palatable heirs. She didn't stop to explain how her son's death wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a genetic warning. and it had already begun to spread. Because while Leopold's case was tragic, it was hardly unique. Several of Victoria's descendants carried the same hidden fragility, and some paid with their lives. 11. Queen Victoria, hemophilic grandchildren. The disease moved quietly, from Leopold to his daughters, from Victoria's other children into the courts of Europe. Hemophilia, rare, fatal, and genetically traceable, became the hidden signature of the Victorian dynasty. And yet, the British royal family rarely acknowledged it outright. Several of Victoria's grandsons inherited the condition. Among them, Prince Waldemar of Prussia, Prince Frederick of Hesse, and Prince Alfonso of Spain. All suffered early deaths. Others lived longer but endured constant medical supervision, missed duties, and whispers of unfitness. The royal attitude? Deny, deflect, distract. Publicly, these boys were seen riding horses, posing for family photos, attending ceremonies. Privately, their lives were shaped by fear, of falls, bruises, cuts that wouldn't clot. There were palace protocols for accidents, locked drawers of medical supplies, and physicians on standby at every estate. But the cover-up wasn't just for dignity, it was political. Admitting the extent of hemophilia in the royal bloodline would have threatened dynastic marriages, alliances, and the perception of royal immortality. And so the silence persisted. Victoria herself kept meticulous records of her descendants. Lineage was everything to her. But she rarely discussed hemophilia publicly. It was treated as an unfortunate byproduct of royal inbreeding, best left to medical journals and quiet family conferences. The disease didn't respect borders. It traveled with her daughters to Russia, Spain, and Germany. And eventually, it reached a boy whose illness would help bring down an empire. But before that collapse, another daughter's story was quietly buried. 12. Queen Victoria, Princess Louise. Princess Louise was the most artistic and least understood of Queen Victoria's daughters. A sculptor, a feminist sympathizer, and a woman who seemed to live slightly out of step with royal rhythm. But there was another side of her story that remains shrouded, not just in mystery, but in strategic omission. Some historians believe Louise may have suffered from undiagnosed neurological or psychiatric issues. There were rumors of sudden disappearances, unexplainable illnesses, and long periods of seclusion. She was frequently indisposed during important events. At times, she vanished from the public eye for months, with only vague explanations provided. Her correspondence reveals flashes of instability, emotional highs and crashing lows, bitterness toward the constraints of royal life, and deep ambivalence about motherhood and marriage. Some speculate she may have experienced breakdowns or neurological episodes consistent with seizure activity. None of it was confirmed. All of it was buried. The royal family didn't just ignore these concerns. They rewrote the narrative. Louise became the modern princess, the bohemian, the rebel, which was easier to sell than the idea of a princess struggling with an invisible illness. In many ways, Louise's story was not erased, it was rebranded. But that's the more elegant form of concealment. And while Louise faded in and out of the official picture, another of Victoria's daughters passed something on with more permanence, something that would reach beyond Britain, into another empire, and eventually into war. 13. Queen Victoria, Princess Alice's children. Princess Alice was Queen Victoria's second daughter, dutiful, quietly intense, and often burdened with more tragedy than anyone seemed willing to acknowledge. After marrying Louis IV, Grand Duke of Hesse, she became the link through which Victoria's most infamous genetic legacy traveled, hemophilia. Her son, Frederick, called Fritti, was the first among Victoria's grandchildren to be diagnosed with the disease. Fritti died at the age of 2 after a minor fall led to unstoppable internal bleeding. His death devastated Alice, but even more unsettling was how quickly the story was softened for public consumption. The child had been frail, they said, delicate. The word hemophilia was rarely uttered aloud, even as Alice's other children became carriers of the same condition, most notably her daughter Alex, later known as Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna of Russia. Queen Victoria was aware of what was happening. She called the disease her family sorrow, but not in public. Behind closed doors, letters between Victoria and Alice reveal a mix of grief, frustration, and maternal dread. Yet the Queen remained committed to the royal brand of invincibility. If her grandsons were bleeding to death from a genetic disorder, it was to be quietly managed, not loudly mourned. Alice died young, and her children went on to inherit not just the disorder, but the silence around it. And in time, that silence would become deadly, especially in Russia. But before the empire crumbled abroad, another of Victoria's daughters brought the disease home again. 14. Queen Victoria, Princess Beatrice's sons. Princess Beatrice, the youngest of Queen Victoria's daughters, was the only one who remained truly under her mother's thumb. She married late and only on the condition that she continue living with Victoria, effectively becoming the royal chaperone. But her sons, Leopold Mountbatten and Maurice, would inherit far more than their grandmother's watchful presence. They inherited her blood. Beatrice was a confirmed carrier of hemophilia. Her son Leopold inherited the full condition. Unlike his namesake uncle, Prince Leopold, Queen Victoria's son, this younger Leopold tried to lead a modern royal life. He served in the military, appeared at public functions, and maintained the outward image of a capable nobleman. But the reality was fragile. Every movement carried risk. Every bruise was a threat. His condition was downplayed in official communications. Only after his death, during surgery for a hip operation, was the severity quietly confirmed. His brother Maurice, though not diagnosed with hemophilia, died in World War I, but not before rumors swirled about his health and fitness for service. The image the family projected was one of quiet, dutiful sacrifice. What they never said was that these young men had grown up in a palace shaped by secrecy, where illness was not just hidden, but rebranded as misfortune or patriotic martyrdom. Beatrice herself lived to an old age, but rarely spoke of her son's conditions. She left behind portraits and letters, but little in the way of explanation. And that silence extended across the Channel, to another grandson of Victoria whose blood would define the fall of a dynasty. 15. Queen Victoria, Prince Alfred Jr. Prince Alfred Jr., the eldest son of Queen Victoria's second son, lived a life overshadowed by confusion, contradiction, and quiet redirection. Known as the hereditary prince of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, he was supposed to be a figure of strength in a newly minted branch of the family. Instead, he became something the royal lineage wasn't built to accommodate, a cautionary tale. Reports from within the German court described Alfred Jr. as troubled, moody, erratic, and increasingly unstable as he reached adulthood. Some documents point to possible psychiatric struggles. Others describe a pattern of decline consistent with neurological illness. The British royal family, while not directly responsible for his upbringing in Germany, monitored his life from afar. And when things began to fall apart, their response was classic: distance, denial, and eventual disappearance from the spotlight. He died young, officially of tuberculosis. But even at the time, rumors spread that his mental health had played a role in his rapid deterioration. Some accounts mention alcoholism, others hint at institutionalization, but none of it made it into royal press releases. Instead, the lines simply moved on. His uncle, the Duke of Edinburgh, stepped into the vacuum, and the family portrait remained undisturbed. To the public, Prince Alfred Jr. was barely a footnote. To the family, he was a potential threat to the story they were telling. That royal blood was stable, noble, and above all, fit to rule. But in Russia, another of Victoria's grandsons would put that myth under even greater strain. 16. Queen Victoria, Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna's son Alexei. Alexei Nikolovich, heir to the Russian throne, was not born in Britain. But his illness was carried across Europe through Queen Victoria's descendants like a quiet political virus wrapped in royal etiquette. Alexei inherited hemophilia from his mother, Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna, Victoria's granddaughter. And in Russia, the condition wasn't just a medical problem. It was a national secret with the structural integrity of a live grenade. From birth, Alexei bled too easily. A bump on the knee could leave him bedridden for weeks. An accidental fall could threaten his life. His parents lived in a state of constant fear, yet the imperial press insisted that Tsarevich was robust, strong, destined for greatness. Meanwhile, the palace hallways were filled with muffled footsteps, hushed emergencies, and physicians who traveled under code names to avoid attention. Alexandra poured her desperation into prayer, ritual, and ultimately into the hands of Rasputin, the mystic whose presence soothed Alexei's symptoms enough to keep the monarchy afloat for just a little longer. But the secrecy surrounding the boy's illness fed rumors, which fed distrust, which fed revolution. The empire cracked along every fault line, and Alexei's condition became both symbol and scapegoat. Queen Victoria never saw the fall of Russia, but the legacy she passed down, thin blood that could topple thrones, played its quiet part. And back in Britain, while revolution raged abroad, her own son faced a different kind of unraveling. 17. King George III. Children with mental health struggles. King George III is remembered for many things: long reign, lost colonies, bouts of mental decline, but what often slips through the cracks is the quiet suffering of his own children. Several of his daughters experienced emotional and psychological distress that never made it into the celebratory royal portraits lining palace walls. Princesses Sophia, Augusta, and Amelia were known to have endured periods of melancholy, anxiety, or what contemporary doctors politely labeled nervous disorders. They lived under suffocating supervision, rarely allowed to marry, often isolated in a palace that functioned more like a moral greenhouse. Their father's instability cast a shadow over them, and the court's response was predictable: silence. Instead of openly acknowledging their struggles, the royal household reframed them as delicate, modest, or simply dutiful, the kind of euphemisms that smooth over humanity until it becomes unrecognizable. Letters between the sisters hint at loneliness, despair, and fear of inherited madness. But the family structure didn't allow vulnerability. Not in public, barely in private. As with their father, explanations were avoided. Symptoms were minimized. The monarchy maintained its rigid facade. And among George III's many children, one boy, adorable, bright, and tragically fragile, became a reminder of how vulnerability was treated in the royal household. 18. King George III, Prince Octavius. Prince Octavius was the 13th child of George III, and by all accounts, the one who softened the king's stern exterior. Gentle, affectionate, and unusually adored, Octavius nonetheless showed early signs of what the court physicians described as constitutional weakness. Today we might interpret the clues as neurological sensitivity or chronic frailty. But in the 18th century, such traits were simply noted and quietly tucked away. Octavius suffered recurring illnesses, episodes of sudden collapse, and developmental concerns mentioned only in diaries. The royal family adored him, but they also protected him, sometimes so thoroughly that he became more symbol than child, hidden behind palace routines designed to prevent the world from seeing how fragile he truly was. He died at age 4 after receiving a routine smallpox inoculation, though some historians believe his underlying health played a larger role than records admitted. George III plunged into grief so profound that courtiers whispered it triggered one of his mental health spirals. But publicly, Octavius's story remained sanitized. A beloved child taken too soon, not a young prince whose vulnerabilities reflected the family's own. His death was treated as tragedy without context, a sorrow without explanation. And yet, the pattern kept repeating: royal children born into privilege, shaped by expectation, and shielded from the world when their realities didn't fit the script. The next royal story pushes that pattern even further, into the realm of pregnancy loss, fragile infants, and a queen whose motherhood was defined as much by absence as by love. 19. Queen Anne. Queen Anne ruled over a kingdom, but lost nearly every child she ever bore. 18 pregnancies, 17 losses. Only one child survived infancy, Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, and even he was described as sickly, hydrocephalic, and unable to walk unassisted for much of his short life. He died at age 11, leaving a throne with no heir and a queen with a legacy soaked in silence. Anne's fertility was treated as national business. Her repeated miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant deaths were quietly mourned but rarely discussed in terms that acknowledged medical or congenital realities. Physicians used vague phrases: childbed fever, a chill, constitutional weakness. But modern interpretations suggest that many of the babies may have had genetic or neurological conditions, or immune deficiencies, that rendered them unviable. One infant was born with clear signs of deformity, though records are sparse and euphemistic. Anne herself became increasingly frail, depressed, and emotionally erratic. Understandably so, though the royal narrative reframed her as tragically virtuous. In portraits, she is posed as the grieving monarch, stoic and maternal, but rarely human. The cumulative weight of her losses, unacknowledged disorders, hidden disabilities, unexplained deaths, was pressed into a sanitized version of suffering. No one ever said she gave birth to disabled children, but no one explained what kept happening either. The throne would pass on, reshaped by succession crisis. But the next royal father would also hide his child's medical condition, this time behind an image of military valor. 20. King James. King James. I came to the English throne with a scholar's mind and a survivor's instinct. He had endured a childhood riddled with political instability, near kidnappings, and religious violence. So when his own son, Prince Henry Frederick, became the bright young hope of the Stewart dynasty, James clung to the boy's reputation with all the strength he could muster. Unfortunately, reputation wasn't enough to conceal what may have been lurking beneath the surface. Prince Henry was hailed as athletic, intellectual, and noble-minded, a perfect contrast to his father's awkwardness. But his life was brief. He died suddenly at age 18, officially from typhoid fever. Yet some historians have long speculated about underlying chronic conditions, possibly autoimmune or congenital, that affected his stamina and caused recurring illnesses well before the final decline. His symptoms were quietly observed, but not publicly acknowledged. Diaries noted that he often appeared pale, short of breath, or fatigued, though these were brushed aside as the result of courtly pressure or overexertion. A royal heir simply couldn't be seen as weak, not when the future of the Stewart line depended on him. James mourned his son deeply, but even then, the official story focused on Henry's heroic death, a noble flame extinguished too soon, not a vulnerable young man with a likely undiagnosed illness. And after Henry's death, attention shifted to the next son, one whose own child would become the subject of similar whispers, because when the crown weighs heavy, it's the children who often falter. 21. King James II. James II wasn't a popular king. Catholic, authoritarian, exiled, he played the role of royal antagonist in the English imagination. But his private life carried its own mysteries, particularly surrounding his son, James Francis Edward Stewart, the so-called Old Pretender. Born into controversy, baptized into suspicion, and raised in exile, this prince's health was an open question disguised as a closed case. Whispers of congenital frailty followed him from birth. Some accounts noted that he had difficulty standing as a child, that his complexion was unnaturally pale, and that he was prone to extended illnesses. Supporters insisted he was simply delicate. Detractors declared him unfit, even illegitimate. Modern historians have debated whether he had a chronic illness or simply suffered from stress-related ailments exacerbated by political paranoia. Whatever the truth, the royal response was typical. Suppress the rumors, insist on strength, and avoid specifics. James II paraded his infant son before the court to counter claims that the child was a substitute or impostor, a myth born from the refusal to admit that a royal baby might be sick. As James Francis aged, his fragility, whether real or exaggerated, became part of the propaganda war. His claim to the throne wasn't just challenged on political grounds, it was questioned biologically. And once again, a royal child became a symbol, not a person. But symbols don't bleed. And the next royal on our list had several children whose illnesses had to be painted out of the frame, literally. 22. King Charles I. King Charles I ruled with an artist's eye and a martyr's self-image. But beneath the carefully posed portraits and theatrical declarations of divine right, his family life reflected an increasingly familiar royal motif: sickly children, concealed conditions, and a relentless campaign to keep appearances pristine. Charles and his wife, Henrietta Maria, had 9 children. Several of them, most notably Princess Elizabeth and Henry, Duke of Gloucester, died young. Official records list common causes: fevers, infections, sudden illnesses. But royal physicians of the time noted persistent patterns: children who struggled to thrive, who showed signs of physical frailty, and who rarely appeared in public until they could be deemed presentable. Portraiture was the primary PR tool of the day, and Charles made full use of it. His children were painted as robust and serene, sometimes even idealized beyond recognition. But letters and court records suggest that at least 2 of them had developmental or neurological delays. These hints are buried between lines. Phrases like slow in learning, not yet walking, or overcome by nerves. Terms vague enough to protect reputations, but specific enough to raise modern eyebrows. None of these children ever received diagnoses, of course. That vocabulary didn't yet exist. But the pattern, a royal reluctance to admit to anything other than strength, was already well established. And Charles would not be the last monarch to project greatness while quietly managing fragility behind the throne. The same illusion would surround his most famous descendant, an heir whose body never matched the weight of the crown he inherited. 23. King Henry VIII, Edward VI. When King Henry VIII finally got the son he had obsessed over for years, England exhaled. The child, Edward VI, was hailed as a divine reward, a political guarantee, and a living symbol of stability. But from the start, Edward's health was precarious, and the royal strategy was predictable: keep the myth alive, even as the boy withered beneath the weight of expectation. Edward was intelligent, pious, and precocious, but also frail. He suffered recurrent fevers, chronic respiratory problems, and periods of debilitating weakness. Court doctors rode in circles, issuing statements that both acknowledged and minimized his condition. The prince is not unwell, one noted carefully, but his constitution is not robust. In public, Edward was paraded with vigor. His tutors praised his brilliance. His court promoted his moral purity, but his reign, if it can be called that, lasted just 6 years. He died at 15, most likely from a combination of tuberculosis and exhaustion. After his death, a sanitized narrative took hold. He had been noble, selfless, tragically brief. What wasn't said, that his body had been collapsing for years, and that everyone around him had known. They simply couldn't say it aloud. Because if a king could be sick, what did that say about the kingdom? And if Henry VIII's perfect son was this fragile, what of the son he had outside of wedlock, whose own body told a similar story? 24. Henry VIII, Henry Fitzroy. Henry Fitzroy was the only illegitimate child that Henry VIII publicly acknowledged, and he was lavished with titles to compensate for his unofficial status: Duke of Richmond and Somerset, Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. groomed perhaps as an alternative heir in case the Tudor succession faltered. But even with all this pomp, Henry Fitzroy carried a secret far more difficult to cloak in ceremony: his health. From adolescence, Fitzroy was known to be sickly. He missed court events, took extended rests in the countryside, and frequently appeared indisposed, a catch-all phrase in Tudor England for anything that couldn't be explained without consequences. Letters from courtiers noted his pale complexion and lack of stamina. He was carefully guarded, sometimes almost hidden from public view, in case his weakness undermined the illusion of strength the Tudors so desperately needed. Some historians speculate that Fitzroy suffered from tuberculosis, but others point to a more general constitutional frailty, perhaps a genetic vulnerability inherited from one of the royal lines. Regardless of the cause, the symptoms were real enough to concern his father, who had long obsessed over virility and legacy. Fitzroy died at just 17, and his death was barely acknowledged with the mourning due to someone of his position. The silence spoke volumes. And just as with Edward VI, the story was rewritten to protect the myth. The prince was noble, brave, beloved, but never frail, never flawed, which is what made the next royal child such a liability. He wasn't merely fragile. He was openly questioned, even in his own time. 25. King Henry VI. Henry VI ruled England during one of its most unstable periods, marked by internal conflict, external wars, and his own frequent retreats from reality. But while his reign was defined by personal and political breakdowns, his legacy as a father carries its own, rarely discussed mystery: the puzzling figure of his son, Edward of Westminster. Edward was the only child of Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou, born into a court swirling with distrust and dynastic rivalry. From the outset, he was a target of speculation, not only because of his contested paternity, but because of his behavior. Contemporary sources described him as aggressive, unpredictable, and emotionally volatile, even as a child. Some ambassadors called him simple. Others said he was wild. By adolescence, he reportedly spoke obsessively of violence and vengeance, especially against his father's enemies. Whether Edward had a behavioral disorder, a developmental delay, or was simply raised in an atmosphere of war and paranoia is still debated. But even then, the royal family knew something wasn't quite right. Henry VI, prone to long catatonic spells, was in no shape to guide his son. And Margaret, fiercely political, may have overcompensated by turning Edward into a symbol of retribution rather than a child in need of help. Edward died at age 17 on the battlefield. Never crowned, never ruling, and never understood. The Lancastrian line died with him. But the pattern of unspoken vulnerability didn't. It would resurface again in royal households eager to maintain stability at any cost, even if that meant rewriting their own bloodlines. 26. King Edward III. Edward III is often remembered as the king who restored English pride after his father's disastrous reign. A warrior, a builder of institutions, a monarch who projected strength. But among his many children, 13 in total, were several whose lives hint at a quieter, more delicate reality. Not all royal heirs were made for battle. While official records present Edward's children as healthy and capable, there are clues buried in letters and household accounts that suggest otherwise. His daughter Mary died young, after a prolonged illness marked by high fevers and seizures. His son William of Hatfield died in infancy. Two other children, Thomas and William of Windsor, also died before the age of 10, with no detailed causes recorded. In medieval terms, this might be dismissed as high infant mortality. But the pattern, especially in a royal household with access to the best care available, raises questions. Some historians have proposed that genetic disorders, perhaps immune deficiencies or congenital conditions, may have played a role in the fragile health of Edward's children. But the medieval court did not permit such interpretations. Weakness in royal children wasn't mourned, it was edited. Portraits were destroyed, names were left off genealogies, and sickly infants were quietly buried under stone slabs bearing only first names. The throne passed on, as it always did, sanitized and uninterrupted. But the cost of that continuity was often invisible, until one king's daughter defied the odds, not by thriving, but simply by surviving what no one expected her to. 27. King James V of Scotland. James V of Scotland died young, overwhelmed by military defeat and illness, but not before leaving behind a daughter who would become one of the most enigmatic figures in European history, Mary, Queen of Scots. Her story is one of political intrigue, imprisonment, execution, but before all of that, it was one of survival against grim odds. Mary was born in December 1542, just days before her father's death. According to legend, James V heard of her birth and muttered, "It came with a lass, it'll gang with a lass," a reference to the Stewart dynasty's fragile hold on power. But there's more to Mary's early years than royal doomsaying. As an infant, Mary was considered physically vulnerable. Reports from the Scottish court mention her frailty, her inability to feed properly, and her susceptibility to infections. Her survival was far from assured. She was whisked away to France at age 5 for political and medical reasons. Part diplomacy, part desperate hope that warmer climates and elite care might preserve her. In France, Mary thrived by courtly standards, but her early health issues were not forgotten. Letters between guardians and physicians describe lingering concerns about her strength, growth, and development. These worries were downplayed publicly. The narrative became one of beauty and brilliance. But behind the embroidery was a child who had barely escaped the fate of so many royal infants before her. And her survival didn't guarantee stability. For one Scottish king, even sons with titles weren't safe from quiet erasure. 28. King Robert III of Scotland. King Robert III of Scotland, born John Stewart, inherited a crown and a crumbling dynasty. But behind his troubled reign was a deeper, more personal tragedy, the story of his eldest son, David Stewart, Duke of Rothesay. A young prince once groomed for kingship, David's life unraveled quickly, and the details of his decline remain suspiciously vague. Some suggest he was politically outmaneuvered. Others believe he struggled with mental instability that the court quietly buried. As a child and young adult, David was described as spirited but erratic. Reports note unpredictable behavior, bouts of what might now be considered mania, and impulsive decisions that strained his father's fragile grip on power. His appointments as lieutenant of the kingdom were marked by controversy, and his conflicts with other nobles were both public and unnerving. Some historians have speculated that David suffered from a psychiatric or neurological condition, undiagnosed, of course, and completely unmentionable in the court's official records. In 1402, at the age of 24, David was arrested and imprisoned at Falkland Palace under murky circumstances. Months later, he died. The cause, officially unknown. Some blamed starvation. Others hinted at foul play. But few wanted to consider a third possibility, that David had become a liability, not because he was a threat to the throne, but because he couldn't meet its impossible standards. Robert III, devastated and increasingly incapacitated, never recovered from his son's death. And when he died the following year, the Scottish crown passed to another child, one who would spend much of his youth in captivity. But further south, another monarch's daughter was learning how to disappear in plain sight. 29. King Edward I. Edward I of England, nicknamed Longshanks, was known for his towering height, iron will, and brutal efficiency. He was the embodiment of medieval kingship, warrior, lawgiver, conqueror. But even Edward's house wasn't immune to vulnerability. His daughter Joan of Acre, often overshadowed by his political campaigns, spent much of her life quietly battling chronic illness. Born in 1272 in the Holy Land during Edward's Crusade, Joan's early years were steeped in political theater. But records reveal that she suffered from prolonged bouts of illness throughout childhood and adulthood. She missed major court events, spent long periods in isolation, and was frequently referred to as delicate or unwell in royal correspondence. Though details are scarce, thanks to the medieval tendency to cloak medical issues in euphemism, there is little doubt she was plagued by recurring health problems. Her first marriage to Gilbert de Clare was as strategic as it was hurried, possibly due to fears over her long-term health. After his death, she scandalized the court by marrying without her father's consent, a rare act of defiance, possibly driven by the knowledge that her time was limited. Joan died at just 35. No cause of death was recorded in detail, and her passing was quickly overshadowed by the political dramas of her surviving relatives. Her fragility was never part of the official narrative, because in Edward's court, strength was absolute. Anything less was quietly removed from the record, and that habit of concealment didn't start with him. It went back to the very beginning. 30. William the Conqueror's descendants. The Normans built their claim to the English throne on strength, military, moral, divine. William the Conqueror wasn't just a king, he was a myth maker, but even myths have cracks. Among his many descendants in the English royal line were whispers of hereditary deformities and chronic conditions, hints of physical impairments that medieval chroniclers chose either to omit or carefully reframe. One of William's sons, William Rufus, was described as red-faced, temperamental, and erratic. Another, Robert Curthose, was mocked for his short stature and awkward gait. Later generations of Norman-descended rulers would be subject to similar scrutiny. Medieval chroniclers, writing with both bias and caution, occasionally referenced crooked limbs, twisted features, or ill-favored forms in royal children. But they rarely lingered on the subject. Such descriptions were either passed off as metaphors for moral weakness, or redacted entirely in later copies. The truth is hard to extract. Disabilities, if they existed, were often camouflaged in symbolism or buried beneath pious explanations. A prince who limped must be doing penance. A child who couldn't speak was marked by divine silence. The language of sainthood conveniently replaced the language of medicine. But even in these early centuries, one thing was clear. The royal image had to be protected at all costs. Physical imperfections were not just biological. They were political liabilities. And so they were edited, shrouded, or mythologized into irrelevance. The blueprint was drawn. The dynasty had spoken. Royal blood could never bleed in public, not unless it served the story.